Good evening and welcome. I'm Regina Martel, President of the Associated Students of Colorado State University. I'm particularly excited about tonight's lecture as it is a very important and critical year with the elections coming. I would like to thank everyone for coming here tonight, and first I'd like to recognize some groups at CSU that helped make this event possible. The Office of the President, Associated Students of Colorado State University, the Association for Student Activity Programming, and the College of Liberal Arts. Thank you to these organizations for their support and for bringing these esteemed political scientists and authors to CSU. Before we begin, I'd like to share the format for this evening's program. To start with, we'll hear individual remarks from each of our speakers, starting with Mr. Ornstein and then Mr. Mann. Following these remarks, Bob Duffy, Chair of the Department of Political Science at CSU, will moderate a question and answer session. There are two ways to submit a question. First, you can fill out a question card, which I think were passed around before we started, and you can submit those and then just pass them to the end of the rows and they'll be read. And if you didn't get a card on the way in, I'm sure you can ask somebody in the back for one. The second way to submit a question is via Twitter, using hashtag CSUMannOrnstein. We'll take as many questions as possible throughout the Q&A period. Following the Q&A, both authors will be outside this hall in the lobby for a book signing. Books will be available for purchase in the lobby throughout the lecture and during the book signing. So with the housekeeping items out of the way, it is now my pleasure to introduce two of the nation's most respected congressional scholars. Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein, whose book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism, has been widely discussed since its release earlier this year, and both have lectured extensively in the United States and abroad. They have studied Congress and its inner workings within the U.S. political system for more than 40 years. Thomas Mann lives in Bethesda, Maryland, and is the W. Averill Herman Chair and Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute who writes a weekly column, Congress Inside and Out, for Roll Call. In addition to their recent release, together, Mann and Ornstein wrote The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. Named by the Washington Post one of the best books of 2006 and called by The Economist a classic. Please join me in welcoming Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann.
Thank you so much, Regina, and thank you for plugging the book. It's Even Worse Than It Looks, which, by the way, makes a great holiday gift. We are both honored and delighted to be here and in this beautiful hall. I was thinking as I came in, this would be a great spot for a football stadium. Just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding. We were a little taken aback by the weather, the winds whipping through us, and we came from Los Angeles, where this morning it was 82 and foggy, just like Clint Eastwood. Of course, the Clint Eastwood appearance at the Republican Convention was one of the highlights of the campaign, and we've been following closely and traveling around. In Tampa at the convention, it was all about the weather. It was the Hurricane Isaac, and of course it got dire enough with all the predictions that Donald Trump canceled his ballyhooed appearance at the convention. Nobody talks about the good things that come with hurricanes. But my favorite moment there was when Herman Cain was being interviewed about the weather, and he was asked if he remembered Katrina. And he said, I never met her, I don't know her, there's no evidence, no evidence. Now, some of the Republicans at the convention freaked out a little bit too much about the weather. I saw Rick Santorum at the Tampa Zoo gathering up 2 of every creature. I thought that was maybe going a little bit too far. And from there, we had Charlotte, the Democratic Convention. I enjoyed Charlotte, and I pick up buttons. I go to, I get campaign buttons. It's always a lot of fun. And the button I picked up in Charlotte was a great big button with a picture of Jenna Jameson on it. Now, I'm sure nobody knows who Jenna Jameson is. She's the most successful porn star in America. And she had endorsed Mitt Romney. She said, I'm rich, so of course I'm going to support Romney. So it was a great big button that said, Porn Stars for America. And I picked it up and I thought, the Democrats are losing the porn star vote. This never would have happened under Bill Clinton. Now, of course, we've been through 3 debates, including a big one last night, the vice presidential debate in the middle. Tom and I watched that one with particular interest, and of course, one of the always seminal moments in a campaign is when a challenger picks a running mate. There's always intense interest and a lot of competition, and Paul Ryan acquitted himself very well in that debate, but we were kind of surprised at the pick of Ryan. I actually thought that, we're not always accurate in our predictions. I predicted that he would pick Newt Gingrich because I thought Mitt Romney wanted the perfect balanced ticket. You get a Mormon and a polygamist. And, but I was wrong. And I was frankly rooting for Ron Paul because, of course, Ron Paul, the libertarian, is for legalization of prostitution and legalization of drugs. And I just wanted to be at the victory party. I like to get you laughing because it's downhill from here on. So I'm going to start with a little bit on why we wrote this book, what the thesis is, and then a minute or two on where we go from here. As Regina said, Tom and I have been immersed in the politics and policy making in Washington and around the country for 43 years at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue and beyond. And we've never seen it this dysfunctional. It was plenty dysfunctional when we wrote our last book, The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. At that point, what we lamented most was that Congress seemed to have lost its identity as the first branch of government. They were not doing the job. There was no regular order. They were not doing oversight. They were not acting as an independent branch. And there was plenty of blame to go around. And when we got approached by the editor of that first book last year about whether we wanted to write something reflecting on contemporary politics, we paused for a minute because we were overloaded with other things, but decided we had something to say and we needed to say it. And it really was that, bad as it might have been then, this is much worse. The level of dysfunction, the partisan and ideological polarization that have grown so sharp, but it's not typical partisan polarization. It's tribal in nature now, and that has grown in a considerable way. Now, what's the difference? A part of it is, if you have partisan differences, you still tend to view the other side as adversaries. And adversaries one day are allies the next. You look at ideas and you may have distinct ideas and views on the world and distinct ideologies, but the fact is a lot of major problems in the society transcend ideology. They can be solved in ways where either you can find common ground or where you just don't have those substantial differences. It becomes tribal when you oppose something, even if you supported it the previous day, just because the other guy is for it. And frankly, we've got in the book, which makes a great holiday gift, example after example to show this and to show how it's happened. And some of it focuses on how we got to this point and why we're at this point. A lot of it reflects on another reality, because many of the forces driving this have been in motion for 40 or 50 years. Massive regional realignment in American life and American political life. When we first came to Washington in 1969, of course, the South was a solid Democratic region. Those Southern representatives who made up almost half the Democratic Party, largely rural and conservative, joined with the rest of Democrats from outside the South, who were far more likely to be urban and liberal, to make a majority. What they had in common was they could be chairs of things and they could have that power, but it also meant that you had a lot of heterogeneity in the party. The Republican Party dominated the West Coast and the Northeast and parts of the Midwest, and a significant portion of those Republicans were moderates and liberals. We used to call the Southern conservatives boll weevils for that insect that infects cotton, mostly in the South, and we call the liberal Republicans gypsy moths for the bug that infects hardwood trees that dominate in the Northeast. But all of that changed. For a variety of reasons that I won't get into here, the Northeast, the West Coast, became solidly Democratic, and the South is now the bastion of the Republican Party, and the parties moved apart, and they now resemble parliamentary parties. They are distinct and different, oppositional in nature, fiercely oppositional, and Tom will reflect on this a little bit more, but you know, the fundamental reality is we don't have a parliamentary system, we don't have a parliamentary culture, and we don't tolerate it very well. And when you end up with parties that are parliamentary, and in particular when you end up with one party that becomes vehemently oppositional in nature and acts as a parliamentary minority, it's fine if you have a parliamentary system like the British or the Canadians, where you can scream all you want, and they do, and it's built into the system, but the majority acts and everybody accepts the legitimacy of those actions, and then they know they've got a place to hold them accountable within a few years. Our culture doesn't accept it when decisions are made by a majority over the vehement opposition of a minority. They view it because the framers set up a system to operate in a different fashion, where half the country is going to see them as illegitimate decisions. And you can end up with, as we've had for the last 2 years, with the nightmare of divided government and an oppositional minority party, which leads to as close to gridlock as you can get. Now, we can go through a lot of other reasons about how we got here and the consequences of those actions. What I would say just in the brief opening is Americans are not happy about this. They know that we've got big problems. But of course, the other reality is that the tribalism that we have seen at the national level has metastasized out to the states, to many states. You've experienced some of it here in Colorado, even more of it in other states, and to a considerable degree to the public as a whole. But there's another reality that many people who are card-carrying members of one of the two tribes also want the parties to get together and find solutions to these big problems. And over the last several elections, they've cast for ways to create accountability, to make a statement. And we've had, up to now, 3 consecutive wave elections. That's unusual in American life. It's even more distinctive and unusual because if you look at 2006 and 2008, we had 2 waves moving in the same direction. It's not like the pendulum swings and then comes back. It swung and then swung out even more widely, favoring Democrats. A reaction against Republicans who had all the reins of power in 2006 under George W. Bush, and even with divided government, still focused on blaming the party of Bush in 2008. And then, of course, we saw the dramatic swing back in 2010. But where do you go from here, where it's hard to pinpoint that accountability? And frankly, perhaps the most likely outcome of the election that is about 3 weeks away is stasis. It's the status quo. It's a second Obama term, Democrats holding the Senate, probably with a reduced number, Republicans holding the House with a reduced number. And whether there's a signal sent with that leads us to a different dynamic, parties behaving differently, or even an instinct that moves us towards solving problems, is not only the great mystery of our time, actually in some ways more significant than who's actually going to win any of these seats or win this election, but also will have a profound bearing on where the country goes from here. And of course, we've got enormous challenges after this election. Those challenges will be there whether we end up with another outcome. There's at least a chance that we could end up with Mitt Romney winning and Republicans moving back to where they hold all the reins of power. We run into an interesting question then, which is, of course, if you look back, if you have parliamentary parties, and one party holds all the reins of power, where at least they could act, we've also had this twist in recent times that reflects the tribalism, that in the Senate we've had radically different behavior than we've ever seen before. The filibuster has been used in ways that it never was over our entire history, raising the bar on everything, routine matters, matters that end up passing unanimously, nominations to 60, and they're not going to be 60 this next time. We may see an attempt to use other mechanisms like the reconciliation process to dramatically transform the country, which is very much divided over all of those issues. We don't know whether all of the jolts that have taken place and the fact that, even though we're likely to end up with the status quo, Congress has an approval rating of about 8% in the most recent poll. John McCain is fond of saying that he and his colleagues are down to support from blood relatives and paid staff. And I can tell you I know many of John's relatives. Pretty shaky group there, too. And I know his paid staff. And they're not all that... but for all of that, that doesn't mean that the signal that you got to knock heads together and resolve the issues of the fiscal cliff in the immediate term, much less the longer-term debt problems that we have, much less some of the other issues that you heard about in the debate last night and we've talked about before, rebuilding or building an education system that can work, dealing with a persistent long-term unemployment for people who may never find jobs that would be the equivalent of what they would have had otherwise, and so many of the other problems that face us. It's a real challenge for the political system, and it goes beyond issues of structure in the system. It's a cultural problem. And a part of what we talk about, too, is how so much of this is related to a tribal media that's emerged, the decline or departure of a public square where we share a common set of facts and then can debate issues hammer and tong, and the absence in the public arena of so many other opinion leaders from outside, including especially the business community, who might put pressure on political figures to move away from things like the unprecedented use of the debt limit as a hostage-taking mechanism, much less the unwillingness to accept the templates that every outside group and some inside groups ranging across the spectrum have found for dealing with that debt problem. Half of our book is about what we might do about this, and that, I hope, will also be a part of some of the discussion that we have remaining. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom to clean up the mess that I've created.
Well, I hope you're sympathizing with me already. I mean, here Gracie has had a role, and George Burns, the straight man, is about to get up and talk serious here. We are just delighted to be welcomed so warmly to Colorado State. It's our first trip here, and I want to express my appreciation to colleagues, including Kyle and Bob and others who've been so gracious in arranging for our visit here. I want to tell you this has been an extraordinary experience. I'm closer to the end than the beginning of my career, but finally, I have something I can use to gain a little respect. Of course, I'm talking about going on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. You know, we held our own, and my kids said afterward, well, maybe there's something to what you do, Dad, after all. You know, it's been an extraordinary experience for both of us. We've been out and around and talked about this book and run into people coming from many parts of our society who are taken by it, in part because they feel the same unhappiness, discontent that borders on anger at times, that nothing is working, that somehow what was supposed to be an American exceptionalism has produced an exceptionally dysfunctional political system. We hear our candidates waxing eloquent about how special and unique we are, and we are, but sadly, in a number of dimensions, the uniqueness puts us down in the crowd rather than leading off. So I think everyone acknowledges something is amiss in our politics. But what we've come to conclude, what really motivated us to write this book, is we think it doesn't go very far beyond that generalized discontent. So we set upon ourselves the task of seeing if we could figure out, to our own satisfaction, in a way that was consistent with scholarly research, with history, with our own observations in Washington for over 4 decades, of what was really amiss, and then save the second half of the book to talk about solutions. What do we do? The great thing about America is not that we got everything right with the framers initially, but that we're a problem-solving, pragmatic people, and when things aren't going right, we recognize it. We acknowledge it, and then we go to work. But you can't go to work if you don't know what's wrong. Instead, you have a kind of visceral response. Throw those politicians out. They're all bums. And, well, okay, and we'll replace them with people who may claim they're not politicians. And God save us if we don't have politicians, because the framers anticipated their people from very diverse parts of the country would send people who were politicians, who were ambitious, but whose efforts would be channeled through a set of institutional arrangements that led them to become problem solvers, to talk to one another in spite of their differences, and to engage in good old-fashioning bargaining, negotiation, and compromise. That's not happening now, and it seemed to us that if we're really going to make any headway, we better get the story straight. And of course, the first part is this just all a myth? We're all wringing our hands and nothing is actually that bad. Certainly, we're not naive about politics. We know it's a physical sport. It's a rough and tumble game, that passions and emotions are involved. This isn't some neutral, emotionless decision-making process. This is a tough game, and throughout our history, we've gone through deeply partisan periods. We just had a commemoration of the War of 1812, and that was a pretty partisan period. Think of the years preceding the Civil War, and then the post-Reconstruction Congresses, the Gilded Age of the 1880s and 90s, and early part of the new century, deep partisan polarization. Emotions ran high, not just rhetoric lacking civility, but physical violence on the floor of the Congress. Members getting beat up by one another with canes. I mean, pretty tough stuff. So there is a tendency among some historians, scholars of political science and others to say, well, we've been there, we'll get through this. It's just a difficult period. And by the way, the bottom line is I think we will get through this, and I think we'll have our government working in the end. But it doesn't come automatically. It comes as the result of people thinking hard about it, going to work, and as citizens, seeing how they can best take actions that might ameliorate the problem. So it's not absolutely new. We've had periods like this, but we don't want to have to solve it by a civil war. We don't want to come to violence. And right now, I came in and I see signs of this all around. You don't have adversaries anymore. You have, if I'm an American, a real American, then you may not be an American. We didn't used to have these questions quite this way. There were always fringe groups on the left and on the right raising them, but now it's a matter of that's commonplace to characterize one's people in another party with whom you disagree on some matters as somehow illegitimate, as not suitable to be involved. That's why the stakes are so high, and anything done in the way of trying to defeat that adversary is justified by the importance of reaching the ends we have identified. This country just doesn't work well with this kind of ideological zealotry, and one of the reasons it doesn't was, as Norm suggested, we don't have a parliamentary system in which two alternatives are offered to the electorate. One wins, and if it's Westminster style with only 2 or 3 parties, but a majority coalition easily formed, they have the wherewithal to put their program in place and then 4 or 5 years to try to implement it and be held accountable. But our system is set up so differently. It wasn't supposed to work like that. Parties are not mentioned in the Constitution, even though they began in the early years of our republic. So it becomes very difficult to take the legitimate differences that the parties are reflecting, values, interests, public philosophy, ideology, policy, prescriptions. Differentiation is good, but if you then let them play out in our system with separate elections for the president, the House, and the Senate, with midterm elections that can reverse the decision of 2 years earlier with 20 percentage points less of an electorate weighing in, you get yourself into real trouble. And when the natural veto points that occur in our system are magnified by what Norm described as the routinization of the filibuster, then majorities can't prevail in any realistic sense of the word. So, first problem, mismatch. Parliamentary-like parties and our separation of powers system, they just don't work together. Now, if that were all, we'd be struggling, but, we'd be figuring out one way or another how to do it. But we have another problem, and this is the awkward one. This is the one that has made us somewhat controversial for guys that have spent 40 plus years being the nonpartisan, analytic go-to guys on the Congress and politics and policy making in Washington. This long period of development of party polarization, of more and more differentiation, following the counterculture of the 60s, then the civil rights movement, the women's movement, Roe v. Wade, the mobilization of conservative religious people, and each sorting themselves into one party or another has over time really produced parties that had less differences within them and became more distinctive, both equal, Democrats and Republicans. But what has happened in more recent times is that the Republican Party has just gone further off the track. We have a very provocative sentence in the book. It first appears in the introduction. We say the Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier. You might call it a radical insurgent, but it's ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited policy regime going back to Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin, skeptical of compromise, dismissive of facts, evidence, and science, and utterly unaccepting of the legitimacy of their political opposition. That's a mouthful. Contains a lot, but we believe, and we document through the research of some of our colleagues as well as our own analysis of the way in which that has happened. It is really quite striking. And the thing to understand is, if it were just a matter of ideological differences, that eventually that leads down to conflicting policies that you can negotiate and compromise. But that's not just what it is. It's more than that. It's strategic. It's a matter of, well, if they're adopting that policy, we're against it, even if we were for it and it was our policy 2 or 3 or 5 years earlier. If they're for it, we're against it. And it involves just a sort of rejection of what the framers thought were the ingredients that were essential for our system to work. And that's the whole notion of compromise. It's the acceptance of differences, the legitimacy of differences within the system. And it's a respect for our institutions, especially the Congress of the United States. A willingness to work within that institutional framework that has kept us together as a people. What this has been developing in recent times, but the election of Barack Obama really set it off in a way that crystallized it for us. We now have evidence from marvelous reporting and frank admission of individuals involved that both the House and Senate Republicans met before Barack Obama's inauguration and made the critical decision to oppose everything, whatever it was, not to negotiate at all, because the route back to power was the failure of the Democratic administration under Barack Obama. Now, to some extent, of course, we want our side and we want their side, but we're in the midst of a financial and economic crisis, the worst since the 1930s. The G20 agrees to coordinate a major financial stabilization and stimulus program, and the countries do it. But the struggle for ours, thank God for George W. Bush, who was willing near the end of his presidency to support an intervention, which was voted down on the House floor by Republican opposition. The stock market dropped 700 points and they rethought it in a few days, but in the end it took Democratic support more than Republicans to work with George Bush to get this done. But then we go to the next stage and it's getting worse. Instead of 3.9% annualized decline in economic growth in the fourth quarter, it was more like 9%. It was stunning, and no one knew it at the time, but pretty soon they did. It was a crisis. They had to deal with it, and Republicans said, no, we will be in opposition. And we document efforts of reaching out, of asking Republicans, what do you want? What do you think would work in this stimulus? Preemptive actions to include tax cuts, and none of it mattered at all. This was all-out war. So you oppose, you obstruct. If you lose that, you drag it out, and then you begin to discredit it. You call it socialism. You call it, communism. You call it un-American. And so you can have one of the most productive 2-year periods in American legislative history, and yet the country is just appalled. They think everything is terrible, and it's because of the nature of the parties in the opposition that has been set up. So that's the dynamic. We really have documented this. I think we're fair-minded. This is not a partisan argument, but it really is an important argument. But here's the key, and I'll end with this and we'll move on to our discussion. What I really worry about is what happens if those who led the battle to oppose and to demonize, who deny against overwhelming evidence among experts, policymakers, the IMF, you name it, that the stimulus was absolutely essential to avoid a much deeper recession, possible depression, that all of it was harmful, that we just should have been cutting government spending and the deficits, and we would have lived on, and all of these programs are doing more harm than good. And they use the filibuster time and again to frustrate that. If that behavior gets rewarded by we the people, what's going to keep Democrats from playing that same role inside the Congress and carry this, institutionalize a parliamentary opposition in a system that can't work with that kind of opposition? That's the questions. That's why we have to think about how do we make democratic accountability work in our political system once again, and how do we return to a less ideological, more problem-solving approach to dealing with our problems. That's the challenge. We have lots of ideas for moving towards them. None of them are as important as you and your fellow citizens around the country getting a handle on this, seeing what's important, not getting caught up in those symbolic ideological wars in which we aren't all Americans anymore, and together we'll fix it. Thank you.
Tom and Norm for their thoughts on Congress, the political parties, and most of all, Jenna Jameson. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, so let's get started. I'll ask a few, and then we're collecting questions throughout the audience, and we'll via Twitter, as mentioned earlier. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what do you think are the most troubling developments in the way Congress operates today? You alluded to a couple of them during here, so maybe you could sort of talk about them in a little more detail.
Okay. Well, you know, we've talked about the filibuster a little bit, but that's certainly a part of it. You know, I'm not going to get into, and we won't get into the history of all of this. It's not in the Constitution. It was unlimited debate in the Senate was an inadvertent element brought in 1805. But if you look at how it operated, the first rule that could actually put some limits on in 1917, this was something used very infrequently by a minority that felt intensely about things, and issues of great national significance. Now, the last few years, and you know, you look at the chart and it's going like this. It is used routinely, and it's not used simply for things of great significance. It's used for everything. It takes a lot of time. The rules are set up so that if you lift your finger and say, we're going to filibuster, and you can do it on a motion to proceed, on the bill itself, on a conference report, multiple times on any given bill, it takes weeks. And after you've overcome it, there's another 30 hours of debate. You don't even have to be on the floor to debate. But this has been used for things that pass unanimously in the end. And it's only for purposes of obstruction. That's simply not healthy. The second is the use of the debt limit for hostage taking. Now, if you go back over the last 70 or 80 years, we've had dozens and dozens of votes to increase the debt limit. It's frankly a really stupid thing. You're not actually increasing the debt, you're ratifying previous debts. We're one of two democracies that have a debt limit. You actually, when you pass appropriations bills and budgets, are incurring those obligations. But it becomes a symbolic thing. And it's been an element of rank hypocrisy for many decades. It's kind of funny to watch in some ways when you step back as you see members of the House and Senate piously saying they're not going to vote to increase debts when the other party's president is in charge, and the members of the president's party saying we've got to be responsible for the country and not endanger the credit limit, and then they just basically switch scripts when the presidency changes. But everybody knew that it was a game. And even when you got votes that were close, both parties' leaders would tell us, we've got votes in reserve if we need to.
we're not going to breach the debt limit and basically damage the full faith and credit of the United States. This time was different. This time it was deliberately used, and it was a strategy hatched before the 2010 elections to take hostages, and the consequences were obvious, dire, and severe. The first downgraded credit in the United States, and now we're doing it again. And after it happened, and we came this close to utter catastrophe, one of the first things Mitch McConnell said was, well, you know, some people said it was a hostage worth killing, but I thought it was a hostage worth taking, and it's going to become routine now. And you play games like that, and the next time, which will happen probably in February, we already have the other ratings agencies saying, we'll downgrade the U.S. if you keep doing this. And they downgraded Standard & Poor's not because we breached the debt limit, we come close before, we came close this time, but they looked at the politics of it and said, we can't trust these people anymore. You play those games, and we're going to continue to play them, and you're not just playing with fire, you're not just playing with live ammunition, you're playing with atomic weapons. That's different, and it's a different way to run a political process, and it's truly disturbing.
Bob, those were the top two I would have mentioned, but there are two others I just want to tell you that I see as problems as a longtime Congress watcher. The first is the utter banality of talk in Congress and in Washington. No one is talking to one another. Everyone is repeating the same spin that's been crafted with their public relations advisors to get the right words because they resonate better than other words, and repeat it again and again and again. There are no debates for the most part. People don't engage, and it's because in part they're operating as teams and they don't have the freedom to engage in that kind of serious discussion, deliberation. You can see it in the House and in the Senate. Remember, the Senate was supposed to be the body that rises to the occasion, raising issues of national import. Good luck. Tune into C-SPAN for a while and follow it. First of all, it's hard to catch them actually in session talking, right? It's usually a quorum call because someone is searching for the 60th senator who will consent to a unanimous consent agreement so they can bring something to the floor. The second, and I'll just raise this because it's so important but it's so complicated, and that's the growing influence of money in politics and elections. Members spend less time in Washington than before. They don't bring their families. They stay home and they demand you begin late in the week and leave early. And while you're there, you're running off to the party committees, getting on the phone, dialing for dollars. Sort of the pressure on members to raise money, not just for their own campaigns, but to contribute to their party's congressional campaign committee and form leadership PACs and give to others so that you might be chosen as a committee chair or something else. And then with hovering over all of this are the new sort of so-called independent spending only committees, the super PACs and their 501c affiliates that live under the protection of the IRS code, which is supposed to be for social welfare organizations, to raise millions of dollars in that denomination often, although for Sheldon it's like in the 10 or 50, $100 million denominations. And so the threat of money coming in, as it will in the next 3 weeks, into dozens of House races and some Senate races, unknown, donor, unidentified, drop $1 million or $2 million into a congressional race and it really makes a difference. Some members are paranoid about that. They're raising money. All of this adds to and contributes to the major problems we identified.
Okay, thanks. Now, you talked earlier in your introductory remarks about how the Republican Party have become insurgent outliers. I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about the events that sort of led us to where we are now. I mean, how did that happen? Is it being driven from below, from the grassroots? Is it coming from party elites in government, top down?
Bob, let me emphasize first that there are no angels here. It's not like you have one party that's pristine and pure and wonderful. And the causes of this go back, and you've got miscreants on both sides. You know, the other day somebody asked me about the Robert Bork Supreme Court nomination, and I said, actually, I could even go back to the Nixon administration and Clement Haynsworth, who was a superbly qualified individual, and you know, you basically had a reaction, let's bring him down and we'll embarrass the president. And it started us down a path now where Supreme Court nominations are treated in a different fashion. So there's some blame on both sides here. But really what moved this to a different plane, what brought us to a point where we would make the kind of flat statement that Tom quoted, I think you could start with Newt Gingrich. We have almost a chapter on Newt. We met Newt when he first came to Congress in 1978. He'd run twice before and lost, and finally got there. And Tom and I were we both just started a project at AEI, where I remain, where we were going to have new members of the class of '78 come in for informal dinners every 6 or 8 weeks or so through their first 2 years and discuss, off the record, their impressions as they move through their term in Congress, and we get a window into the Congress. It turns out it was an extraordinary class, and we were both lucky and skilled at choosing people who accepted. So in our group were Newt Gingrich, Dick Cheney, Geraldine Ferraro, among others. But Newt stood out. He had a full-blown theory, a strategy with tactics for how you could move from what was then a 24-year consecutive stranglehold of Democratic majorities in the House to achieve a Republican majority. It took him 16 years, but we're going to destroy this House in order to save it. We're going to make it tribal. We're going to radicalize all of the Republicans in the House who've worked with Democrats, but have done it from a minority, second-class citizen position. Get everybody to unite against. We're going to use ethics as a political tool. And then we're going to convince the country that this place is so awful, so rotten, so corrupt that anything would be better than this. There'll be a national election, we'll make it work. And that set us down a path. And it's a path that moved over to the Senate. We were just with a very good political scientist named Sean Theriot, who's got a book coming out called The Gingrich Senators. And I'll give you one example of how all of this worked as they tribalized. It happens to be a true story. Alan Simpson, who's a great problem solver, went back to visit the Senate a few years ago, having left the body some time before, and ended up walking onto the Senate floor with Rick Santorum, then still in the Senate, who had been part of that Gingrich generation and moved over. And as they walked onto the floor, Simpson saw Dale Bumpers, Democrat from Arkansas, went over to the Democratic side, embraced him. They had a warm conversation, and he looked over and saw Santorum kind of agitated, motioning him back. So Simpson went back and said, well, what's that all about? And Santorum says, we don't do things like that around here anymore. Now, I asked Simpson after that, was that because you were embracing a guy or because you were embracing a Democrat? And he gave me a very pithy response that I won't repeat here. But, you know, the fact is, the kind of tribalism that you don't talk to people on the other side, you don't embrace people on the other side, you don't work with people on the other side, moved in that direction. And if you then put that together with the new tribal media, amplified by the social media, and a culture in which lying doesn't bring you any sense of shame or approbation. If you lie and you get caught in a lie, you double down on it, and you probably get your own cable television show, or a best-selling book, or if you're a political figure, the money comes rolling in. And all of that has created a problem, but it's a problem that has been significantly more on the one side than the other.
Tom, you have anything to add to that?
I mean, Norm has it right there are many things involved. One of the important dimensions is this is not isolated from the country. I think it's so important to understand. There are people who will argue, and scholars who will argue, that, well, this is just the elites in Washington, that the great mass of the citizenry are instinctively pragmatic, problem-solving, moderate, centrist, you name it. It's just, as you move up the level of activity and participation, you know, people get more tribal. Well, that's not quite true. It turns out if you include 40% of the voters who, of the citizenry who don't vote at all, I suppose you could say they're moderate because they don't have any ideology of any kind. They have little information, little knowledge, but it's not as if they are directing the country. That is, it isn't a powerful movement to do this. It's the absence of a movement. And then if you look at the 60% who vote now in presidential elections, most of us identify, however we register, we like to register as unaffiliated or independent. Makes us look thoughtful, right? It's safe, but we also have a psychological attachment to one party or the other, and those who say they're independent instead of Democratic or Republican, when pressed, will say, well, they're closer to the Republican or Democratic Party. That counts for 90% of the voters. There are only 10% pure independents, and if you look at those pure independents, I mean, they're not all the same, but the overwhelming sense is that they are not very interested in politics or public affairs and don't follow it. We now have skits on Saturday Night Live on undecided voters. How can anyone be undecided at this point? Mainly because they aren't following things. I accept that. Busy lives and so on. Consensus broke down in this country that we had at the beginning of the 1960s. Dwight Eisenhower now would be seen as a left-wing Democrat, I suppose. Things have changed, but Dwight Eisenhower legitimated the New Deal as a Republican president, built the interstate highway system, and was cautious on military activity and intervention. He was really quite an extraordinary president, but the Keynesian consensus broke down, supply-side economic. If you cut taxes, everything gets better under other circumstances, and that leads to a Grover Norquist and a no new tax pledge. We didn't have cultural issues on the agenda, but first race, and then religion more broadly, and issues associated with abortion and same-sex relations have led to an intensity in the participation within the parties that's added to it. And it's one of the reasons that Republicans have moved in the way they have and seem to be acting in a more radical fashion is because they've moved to a sort of hyper-individualism and a really deep skepticism about government, not against big government, sure, wasteful government, sure, but going back to the framers, the first publicly funded healthcare program was under George Washington. And government has always played a role. We found the balance between sort of individual freedom and community and government action. And Republicans have now veered off that, and that leads them to more radical positions.
All right, thanks. Now I'm sure we have some questions out there.
We do. Thank you, everyone, for your questions via note card and Twitter. I'm going to do my best in the short time we have remaining to consolidate some of those questions, so I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question, but we'll do our best. The first question relates to, and I'm going to combine a few questions here. What role does the public play in facilitating the elite polarization and policy gridlock that now dominates American politics? And in addition, what are your suggestions for democratic accountability?
First, of course, the public plays a significant role here, although we have to keep in mind that the public makes its choices constrained by a political process that gives them options. And those options often come through primaries or caucus systems that can give them choices that move to extremes. You may not have the right opportunities, but even with that, the public is not blameless here. And a part of it is something that Tom mentioned. We seem now, because of our disaffection with politicians, leaders of almost every institution, anybody who pops up and says, I'm not like the rest of them, Herman Cain, I don't speak politician, gets additional traction. And what we're doing is leaching out of the system. What voters are doing is leaching out of the system the problem solvers and bringing in people who think they've got all the answers but don't care about institutions, don't know about how the process is supposed to work, do not have respect for the regular order, and believe that it's all black and white. And buy into notions that, Jason Chaffetz of Utah, reflecting back on the debt limit, said, we would have brought the whole thing down. Why not? And he's popular. We're not punishing people who move away from problem solving, and we're rewarding them in some ways. So that's certainly a part of it. What do we do about it? Well, one thing that we believe very deeply is we actually have to rely more on people, but we've got to enlarge the electorate. And we have a variety of ways of doing that. Some are more radical than others. If we had our druthers and could wave a magic wand, and that's what it would take, we would implement a version of the Australian system of mandatory attendance at the polls. You don't have to vote in Australia, but if you don't show up, you can cast a ballot for none of the above, and you don't write an excuse explaining why you couldn't make it, you're subject to a fine of around $15. Well, every election since they've implemented the system, the turnout has gone to over 90%. Now, the difference is if you don't have base-driven politics. If you know that your base is going to be there as a political figure and their base will be there, you focus on issues that matter to the voters in the middle, and that can change things. We're not likely to do that. One other alternative is to turn it around and look at incentives. So I'd love to see a Mega Millions lottery where your lottery ticket is your vote stub. We would increase turnout dramatically overnight with that. But otherwise, imagine if every state adopted a version of the open primary, where you can extend it beyond. But what we'd like to do is a variation. It's not just an open primary where independents can vote and people from any party can vote and all the candidates involved, but preference voting, so that if there are third, fourth, fifth, sixth candidates, you can actually then begin to get a larger preference and not have extremists win under circumstances where spoilers are involved. So there are a lot of things to do that may be involved here, but we also, and a part of what we want to do in the book is to educate people. You've got to look at your choices in a different way. Look at candidates and see who you think will be a problem solver or who will be a tribalist.
Okay, and to extend on that, actually we have a question that's right on point, that's a great follow-up. The problems we're seeing in the political system are caused and exacerbated by elites, but many of the suggestions outlined in your book would have to be implemented by said elites. How can we get around this paradoxical problem?
The marijuana initiative. Get them all stunned and then we can move in.
Elites.
Listen, we are not a direct democracy. We're a Republican form of government. We have a division of labor. Citizens have a critical role, but so too do the people they elect to serve in the White House and the Congress and state governments and the rest. And it's always the case that the public is going to understand and relate to and make choices based on their understanding that comes in part from the elites who are in office. And so if they have a set of perverse incentives to set party against party, you know, they will go to work on it. It will be reinforced by the partisan presses, where many people go for their information, and it gets reinforced, and those people with even more disposition to act like that are elected, and it's a circular process that, and we've got to break that cycle. We have to have other voices. We have to have people speaking out in ways that we don't hear from. We have to have other people outside of elective office. The business community has been absent from some of the absolutely critical actions. A generation ago, there were leaders out there who university presidents would be called and have the ability to do this, and other civic leaders. That's what it's going to take, I think.
Just one additional comment. Tom talked about money. We join with John McCain and Sandra Day O'Connor, among others, in believing that Citizens United was the worst decision made by the Supreme Court, at least in our adult lifetimes. It's pernicious. It's reinforced by many other things. But one way we could change it is a generous retirement fund for Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote the decision.
And now, with our remaining time, let's turn to some more solutions. One of the more realizable solutions that you propose in your book is filibuster reform. Could you tell some stories about how we've gotten to this position with regard to the filibuster, and also discuss why are both parties so averse to filibuster reform? Because there's a lot of different demographic trends, for instance, for the Democrats that would seem to be something that they would want filibuster reform in place, et cetera, et cetera. So that's combining about 5 questions.
Just a couple of things. The first is, you know, the filibuster stuff, we should add, is not all one-sided. One of the things that happens is that majority leaders, and this was true on both sides as the number of filibusters began to go up, would basically cut off amendments from the minority. They use a process called filling the amendment tree, which, you know, enraged the minority and gave them more incentive to use more filibusters. But we've moved way beyond that. It's a convenient excuse. You don't filibuster a nomination that ultimately passes 99-0 if you're enraged because you're not allowed to offer amendments. You don't offer amendments on nominations and on bills that pass 100-0 or on bills where there are amendments. What happened was a conscious decision to, and this is something, there's an interesting quote from actually Bob Bennett, one of the victims of this process, a problem solver thrown out by his own party because he was a problem solver. But before that, he was a party leader. And he said to Michael Grunwald, who wrote a wonderful book on the stimulus and how it went through, that it was something that reinforced or actually ratified what Joe Biden had said to him, which is Biden, who'd served in the Senate for 36 years when he became vice president, talked to a number of Republicans, talked to 8 of them about trying to find some common ground, and they said, you know, our leadership has told us we're not going to do that. And he went to find some of them. And Bennett very candidly said, look, Mitch McConnell told us after Obama got elected, we're going to do whatever we can to throw sand in the works to keep anything from happening. Now, when you do that, the mechanism that's available to you is the filibuster. And if you're not called on it, and, you know, let's face it, a part of this is a media problem. When you write a story that says, bill fails in the Senate, but it got 55 votes out of 100, and it failed on a filibuster, and you don't mention that, there's no accountability. Now, just to comment on your last point, senators as individuals have a lot of individual power that comes from the hold, which is basically a notice that you will filibuster, and it just automatically blocks something from happening. And if you can use that, you have the ability to take hostages, sometimes even if it's your own party's president, because you want something and they're not paying attention to you. Cabinet officer is brushing you off. The White House won't give you the time of day. Or you can use it for other, more nefarious purposes.
And it's spread widely, and secretly none of them want to give it up. And with the filibuster, you talk to people on both sides, whenever they're in the minority, they use it. It becomes a weapon. You're very hesitant to give something up for a short-term gain when it may bite you on the behind a year or two later. But I think what you also see now with Democrats in the Senate is they become so frustrated by the misuse that they're looking for a mechanism that can turn it around. And we've worked closely with them to find something that doesn't destroy the filibuster, but turns the onus to the minority, not to the majority. You want to do it? You feel intensely enough about it? You be on the floor around the clock. You be forced to come up with 40 votes to keep debate going, instead of forcing the majority to come up with 60 votes, which occasionally meant dragging 92-year-old Robert Byrd out of his hospital bed to come to the floor to cast that vote. The onus should be on the minority. Whether you get there is another matter, and how much difference it'll make, given all these other cultural issues, we can't say.
Remember, the whole idea of a filibuster is to continue debate. But we have no debate when there's a filibuster. We just have a refusal to approve a unanimous consent agreement. That's the only way you can get anything to the floor in the Senate. There's no rules committee, and so someone objects. So that's the difficulty we have right now. It was never imagined that it was simply a supermajority requirement. That's not how it's supposed to work, but that's how it does work, and it's perverse. So as Norm said, the object is on some things that are essential for government to operate, like filling offices in a new administration. They ought to be fast-tracked. All nominations, must be dealt with by committees. If they approve them, within X days, they go to the floor for the Senate, and there's a guaranteed up or down vote. But in other matters, you really change, as Norm said, the burden of proof, and it turns out it's very complicated to do that, the way the rules work. But the basic thing is, if you can't keep 41 members on the floor, and no one is there, boy, the majority can move in the absence of that. And so you want an opportunity for a minority that feels strongly about a matter and believes that if they took to the floor and it was publicized, the country would rise up and support them. That's the whole idea. And we have to get back to that as a notion and away from the routinization, just ordinary business, there's a supermajority rule. That is so anti-democratic, and not a single framer had that in mind when they drafted our founding document.
Okay, and this is probably our last question. 6 or 7 people asked about the role of money in politics with regard to the dysfunction that we see. And you spoke a little bit about Citizens United already. But there's a lot of questions about what can we do about it, relates to some of the things we talked about earlier as well.
Listen, this is as I said, it's a big, big topic, and it's particularly problematic in our country. All countries have problems managing this. It's problematic because of the way in which the courts over time have interpreted the meaning of free speech in the First Amendment to the Constitution, and effectively have accepted the argument that money is equivalent to speech. And if you don't have the means to speak, then you're being kept from speaking. And that has led to a perverse set of rulings going back to Buckley v. Vallejo, in which the court said, well, you can limit contributions, the size of nature of contributions, because, there could be some corruption involved or the appearance of corruption, but you can't limit expenditures at all, and you can't limit the ability of an individual to act with his or her own resources nor can you limit the activities of a group that comes together to speak independently about a particular campaign. So it's always been problematic, but as Norm said, the breakthrough was Citizens United, in which corporations were deemed to have the same rights as individuals when it comes to spending, not contributing, but to spending in campaigns. And then a Speech Now decision of a lower court sort of legitimized the formation of these independent-only, non-connected political action committees, which someone labels super PACs, and that's the situation that we have right now. What to do, replace some members of the Supreme Court with people who are more sort of tolerant and open of the notion of some kind of reasonable limits, amend the Constitution to give the Congress some limited powers to restrain the role of money in politics. Those are both kind of long-term projects, but I could see building a social movement on behalf of a constitutional amendment. But in the short term, we've got two things we can do. One, more and more of the money being spent is evading the requirements of transparency and disclosure. And so let's embarrass people who pump millions in that give to a 501c4 because they don't want to be identified. That's not how the law works, and it's not what Anthony Kennedy said it would work in his decision upholding this provision. Secondly, we've got to figure out a way to really empower the small donors. Where's Judy? This is working. Individuals are beginning to play a part in the political process. It's easier now online with a credit card, $5, $10, $50, $100. What if, like New York City, we matched those small contributions with a multiple match of public dollars to give the citizens even more incentive to contribute, and the politicians to go after those small donations and gradually build an army of millions of small donor contributors that go up against the billionaires pumping and the other groups with special agendas and interests. So those are the approaches to reform that are before us. None of them are easy, but we shouldn't give up on it.
Let me just add that you should be very worried about this. And it's not, the focus now is the presidential campaign. All that money will matter, but it's not the decisive factor in a presidential campaign. The candidates have plenty of opportunities to get their messages across, to mobilize. They've got resources. As you start to move down levels, that's when it really becomes a problem. And I can tell you already, we've seen one very rich guy basically buy the legislature in North Carolina. And what he did, his name is Art Pope, he went into the primary elections heading into 2010 and targeted moderate Republicans as well as Democrats to radicalize. And they've done it. The Koch brothers just spent $3 million, it's like lunch money for them, to do the same thing to the legislature in Kansas. And now they're moving in Arkansas. And now they're going after judges. They're going to knock off judges in retention elections, 3 targeted in Florida, 1 in Kansas, and all over the country, and put in judges who reflect their viewpoint. Imagine a corporation coming in that doesn't like a decision made or wants to tilt the court so it can do things whatever it wants. It doesn't take a huge sum of money. Where's the judge going to get money to run an election campaign? From the people who practice in front of him or her. Is that a healthy process? What's more fundamental to a free society
whether it's here, in the Arab Spring countries, in the former Soviet Union republics, or elsewhere, than an independent judiciary, in China. We've taught that lesson for years. We're in danger of losing our independent judiciary. And frankly, judicial elections are ridiculous to begin with. It's a cancer in the system. But when you turn judicial elections into exactly the same thing as elections for political office, and then bring in this extra money, the fundamental fabric of this society is endangered, I believe, in a way that we simply haven't seen in these previous periods of stress. So this is something you really all ought to be thinking about, and thinking about ways to act on, and the things that Tom has talked about, pushing for transparency and disclosure, pushing not just legislators but the IRS to do its job and enforce its own rules, trying to create a federal election commission that actually enforces the law, which is something we do not have right now, and pushing for the kinds of reforms to empower small donors with matching funds. These are doable, tough but doable, and boy do we need people to mobilize.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for being here with us tonight. I appreciate your thoughtful discussion. You've given us something to think about. So let's give Tom and Norm a final round of applause.